She didn't choose him. That single sentence is enough to collapse everything you think you know about marriage in the world of Jesus. No candlelit dinner, no lingering glances across a crowded room, no courtship, no dates, no slow unfolding of attraction. The woman who would become a wife in first-century Galilee or Judea did not meet her future husband the way the modern mind imagines. She did not fall in love first and then commit. She committed first, and love, if it came at all, was something that grew slowly, like wheat in rocky soil, after the contract had already been sealed, after the gifts had already changed hands, after her name had already been bound to his before God and the village elders. And yet, this is the world in which Jesus grew up. This is the soil from which his most intimate parables about weddings, waiting, and faithfulness were drawn. This is the system that shaped Mary and Joseph, that governed the households of his disciples, that defined what it meant for a woman to be honored, protected, or abandoned. If you have ever read the Gospels and felt that something about the wedding imagery, the betrothal references, or the parables about brides and bridegrooms was just slightly beyond your reach, you were right. You were standing outside a world you had never been fully shown. Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. What did it actually look like the first time a young woman in Nazareth learned who her husband would be? Who was in the room? What was said? And what was never said at all? What did she feel? And what was she permitted to feel? And what does all of this have to do with a parable about 10 virgins waiting with lamps in the dark? Or with the extraordinary dignity Jesus showed toward women in a culture that gave them almost none? These are not small questions. They reach into the architecture of daily life in the ancient Near East, into clay-walled homes with packed dirt floors, into conversations held in olive groves and on rooftops at dusk, into the quiet negotiations of fathers who held the future of their daughters in calloused hands. To understand how a bride met her husband in the time of Jesus is to understand something foundational about what marriage meant, what women carried, what men owed, and what God was saying when he used the image of a bridegroom coming for his bride as a picture of the kingdom itself. We begin not with a wedding, but with a house. Picture a village in the lower Galilee region, sometime in the 1st century of the Common Era. The houses are small, built from undressed limestone or mud brick, clustered together along narrow, unpaved lanes that smell of dust and animal dung and wood smoke. There is no separation between the domestic and the agricultural. The courtyard of a family home is where grain is ground, where goats are penned at night, where olive oil is pressed in late autumn. The walls are thick to hold out the summer heat. The ceilings are low. Light enters through 1 or 2 small openings covered with cloth or wooden shutters that never fully close against the wind. Inside one of these homes lives a girl. We will call her by the most common name of her world, Miriam, who is somewhere between 12 and 14 years of age. She has been grinding barley since before sunrise, the way she has every morning for as long as she can remember. Her arms know the rhythm of the grinding stone, the way a musician knows a melody. Her fingers are already roughened at the tips. She knows how to card wool and spin thread, how to keep a fire alive through the night with dried dung cakes, how to stretch lentils and dried figs across a week when the stores run low. She knows the prayers, the Sabbath rituals, the names of her ancestors going back further than most boys in the village could recite. She is, in every practical sense, fully prepared for what is coming, even though no one has told her yet what it is. Because if you are drawn to this content, to the world behind the Gospels, to the history that makes the faith breathe, then stay close. Subscribe to this channel, and every week we will walk together through the world Jesus actually lived in, one stone and one season at a time. Her mother knows. Her father knows. Perhaps her older brother knows or suspects. In the social world of first-century Jewish Palestine, marriage was not a private arrangement between two individuals discovering each other. It was a transaction, a sacred, legally binding, publicly witnessed transaction between two families. And the negotiations that would determine Miriam's future had likely been underway for months, possibly longer, conducted entirely without her presence and with only the most cautious involvement of her own voice. The initiative, in almost every case, came from the groom's side. A young man, or more precisely, his father, would identify a suitable young woman from an appropriate family. Suitability was not primarily about personal compatibility. It was about lineage, reputation, economic standing, and the network of social obligations that connected families in a small village where everyone's survival was partially dependent on everyone else. A family that made a bad match risked not just shame, but the fracturing of alliances that could mean the difference between borrowing tools during a lean harvest and being refused. This was not romance. This was infrastructure. The groom's father would approach Miriam's father, sometimes directly, sometimes through an intermediary, a trusted elder or relative who could soften the negotiation and absorb any awkwardness if the offer was declined. They would meet, likely in the courtyard or at the village gate, the traditional gathering point for legal and communal business. There would be food offered, the basic hospitality that could not be refused without insult. There would be talk of weather, of harvests, of shared acquaintances, before the real subject was raised. And then, carefully, the proposal would be made. Miriam's father would not answer immediately. That would have been considered rash, even disrespectful, a sign that the family had not thought seriously about what they were being offered, or worse, that they were desperate. A good father in first-century Jewish Palestine was measured in part by how deliberately he handled the futures of his children. He would listen. He would ask questions, careful ones, about the young man's character, his trade, his health, the state of his father's land or workshop. He would nod slowly and say that he needed time to consider, to pray, to speak with his wife. And he would mean it, not as a diplomatic evasion, but as a genuine process of discernment that could take days or even weeks. Meanwhile, Miriam would know that something was happening. In a household of 4 or 5 people living in 2 rooms, very little could be truly hidden. She might have overheard pieces of the conversation in the courtyard. She might have read the shift in her mother's expression at the grinding stone, the way her father sat with unusual stillness after the evening prayer. She might have been told something oblique and incomplete, enough to prepare her heart without overwhelming her. Or she might have known nothing at all until the morning her father called her name with a particular weight in his voice. What she was not doing was choosing. This is the part that requires the modern reader to slow down and resist the urge to project contemporary frameworks onto an ancient world. The absence of personal choice in this process was not understood by most families in first-century Galilee as cruelty or injustice. It was understood as protection. A young woman who negotiated her own marriage would have been navigating a legal and economic system she had no formal tools to navigate. A world where contracts were binding, where a woman without a husband or a father had almost no legal standing, where a broken betrothal could leave a young woman permanently unmarked by shame in ways that would follow her children. The father's role was not to override his daughter's personhood. It was to use his experience, his social knowledge, and his authority to secure for her the best possible future he could construct. That does not mean the system was without suffering. It plainly was not. There were fathers who were careless, greedy, or blind to their daughter's pain. There were matches that were unequal in age, in temperament, in basic human dignity. The system carried within it the capacity for real harm. And the prophetic tradition of Israel knew this, which is why the Torah contained unusual protections for women that had no parallel in the surrounding cultures of Egypt, Babylon, or Rome. But within the system, as it was designed and ideally practiced, the father was meant to be a guardian, not a trafficker. And here is where a detail emerges that most modern readers entirely miss. In many documented cases from this period and region, the young woman's consent was sought, not in the form of a veto that could override her father's decision, but in the form of a genuine inquiry, a question asked of her in the presence of her mother, before the agreement was finalized. Rabbinic literature from the period following Jesus preserves strong statements, insisting that a father should not betroth his daughter without her agreement. The practice was not uniform, not legally enforceable in the way a modern consent framework would require. But the moral expectation existed, and it mattered. So there would have been a conversation. Perhaps it happened in the evening, after the younger children were asleep, in the faint orange warmth of the oil lamp that sat in its niche in the wall. Her mother would have been present. Her father would have spoken with a formality that itself communicated the seriousness of what was happening. He would have said a name, the name of the young man, the name of his family, perhaps something brief about his trade or his land. He would have described the terms being discussed. And then, in some form, he would have asked her what she thought. What did Miriam feel in that moment? The honest answer is that we cannot know precisely, but we can know the emotional landscape she inhabited, because we can reconstruct the world that had shaped her. She had grown up watching the marriages around her, her older sister perhaps, or her cousins, the women in the village whose lives she had observed since childhood. She understood that marriage meant leaving her father's house and entering her husband's. It meant becoming the primary woman of a new household, responsible for its food, its fabric, its fire, its children. It meant a legal and covenantal bond that would define her status, her security, and her identity for the rest of her life. Marriage in this world was not primarily about companionship or romantic fulfillment, though those things were not absent from the human experience of it. It was about survival, about continuity, about the sacred obligation to build a household in which the next generation could be raised in the covenant of Israel. She would have weighed the name her father spoke against everything she knew or could learn about that name. Had she seen him at the well? Had she heard his voice carrying across the village square during a festival? Did his family have a reputation for kindness or for hardness? Was there anything in what she had observed from a careful, permissible distance that made her stomach tighten with dread? Or, perhaps, with something quieter and less nameable, something not yet fear and not yet hope? The betrothal contract, once agreed upon by the fathers, was not a casual promise. It was a legally binding covenant, in Hebrew, the erusin, that was in many respects already marriage, in its full legal weight. The young woman was from that moment considered legally bound to her future husband. She was referred to, in the language of the community, as his wife. He was her husband. And yet, they did not live together. They did not share a home, a bed, a table, or daily proximity. The erusin was the sealing of the covenant. The nisuin, the actual taking of the bride into the husband's home, would come later, typically after a waiting period of approximately 1 year. This gap, this interval between the legal reality of marriage and the lived experience of it, is the space in which some of the most important events in the New Testament unfold. It is the space in which Mary receives the announcement of the angel. It is the space in which Joseph, discovering that his betrothed is pregnant, faces a decision whose weight can only be felt once you understand exactly what Erusin meant. That to divorce her quietly, as Matthew records, was an act of extraordinary legal mercy in a context where public accusation and its consequences were fully within his rights. It is the space in which the entire metaphor of the bridegroom who departs and will return, who has betrothed his people and is coming back to bring them home, was drawn directly from the lived structure of everyday Jewish marriage. The world was not using metaphors that were vaguely poetic. It was using metaphors that every person in the audience knew from their own bodies, their own households, their own waiting. The year of waiting was not empty. This is something that the modern imagination tends to flatten into a simple pause, a kind of holding pattern before the real story begins. But in the world of first-century Jewish Palestine, the interval between betrothal and the taking of the bride into her husband's home was one of the most dense, consequential, and emotionally charged periods in the entire arc of a young woman's life. It was a year, sometimes more, during which everything was simultaneously decided and unfinished. She was legally a wife. She lived as a daughter. She belonged, in the eyes of the law and the community, to a man she had spoken to perhaps once or twice, in the guarded and supervised conditions that the culture permitted. And she waited. The preparation during this period was not ceremonial or symbolic. It was practical to the point of being exhausting. In her father's house, Miriam would have been intensifying everything she already knew: the grinding, the weaving, the preservation of food, the management of oil and fire. Her mother would have been teaching her with a new urgency, no longer the patient instruction of childhood, but the brisk, efficient transmission of a woman who knows her daughter is about to become responsible for her own household. How to manage the stores across a full season. How to recognize when the oil jar is low enough to be dangerous before the lamp goes out in the night. How to stretch lentils and dried fruit across a week when illness or weather disrupts the usual rhythms. How to manage a pregnancy while still maintaining the household. How to speak to a mother-in-law with respect without disappearing entirely into her shadow. In the groom's household, something parallel and equally physical was underway. The young man, or more precisely, the young man under his father's direction, was preparing a place. This is not a poetic phrase. It was a literal architectural reality. In the typical extended family compound of first-century Galilee, multiple generations lived in adjoining rooms or structures around a shared courtyard. When a son married, it was common practice for him to add a room, or in some cases a modest separate structure, onto his father's house. This addition was the home he would bring his bride into. It was built with his own hands, or with the hands of his father and brothers, using the same undressed limestone or mud brick that made up every other structure in the village. The quality of this room was a measure of his character. A young man who built carefully, who checked the mortar between the stones, who sealed the roof against the winter rains with packed clay and straw, who ensured there was a proper niche in the wall for the oil lamp, a proper place for the storage jars, a proper door that could be barred from inside, was a young man who was taking seriously his obligation to protect and provide. A room that leaked, that let in the cold, that had no secure threshold, was a room that announced something about the man who had built it. In a world where physical shelter was not guaranteed, where a family without a sound roof could lose grain stores to mold or children to fever, the room was not a gesture. It was a promise made in stone. Jesus knew this. He had almost certainly helped build such rooms in Nazareth, under the hands of Joseph, whose trade, the Greek word tekton used in the Gospels, encompassed not only woodworking, but the broader work of construction and craftsmanship. When Jesus says, in the Gospel of John, "In my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you," he is not reaching for a vague spiritual metaphor. He is drawing on a gesture his audience had seen their fathers and brothers perform with their own hands. The bridegroom leaves. He goes to build. He returns when the place is ready. Everyone in that room understood exactly what he meant, down to the smell of cut stone and fresh mortar. But what of the bride during this year of waiting? She continued to live in her father's house, but her status had changed in ways that were visible and felt. She was no longer simply a daughter available for betrothal. She was a betrothed woman, in the eyes of the law, already a wife. And her behavior, her movements, her visibility in the public spaces of the village were all understood through that lens. The honor of two families now rested on her, not in a theoretical sense, but in the most immediate social sense. What she did, where she went, who she spoke to, how she carried herself in the marketplace or at the village well, all of it was watched and interpreted. The well was, in fact, one of the few spaces where young women in this culture had sanctioned public presence. Fetching water was a necessary daily task that could not be delegated to men without social awkwardness. And so it was at the well, early in the morning, often, that women encountered one another, exchanged information, and navigated the careful social choreography of village life. It is not accidental that multiple pivotal encounters in the biblical narrative happen at wells. Rebekah meets Abraham's servant at a well. Rachel meets Jacob at a well. The Samaritan woman meets Jesus at a well. The well was one of the only places where a woman's presence was both necessary and unremarkable, which made it, paradoxically, one of the only places where genuine human encounter across social lines could happen. For a betrothed young woman, the well was also a place of a particular kind of loneliness. She would have seen, in the faces of the married women around her, glimpses of what her life was about to become. She would have heard conversations about households and children and husbands, conversations that now had a new relevance, a new weight. And she would have carried, through all of it, the quiet knowledge that everything was about to change in a way she could not fully prepare for, because no one can fully prepare to become a different person in a different house under a different name. The oil lamp appears again here, and it is worth pausing on it because Jesus paused on it too. In the parable of the 10 virgins, recorded in Matthew chapter 25, 10 young women are waiting for a bridegroom who is delayed. 5 of them have brought extra oil for their lamps. 5 have not. When the bridegroom finally arrives, at midnight, the 5 without extra oil find their lamps going out. And by the time they return from buying more, the door is shut, and they are left outside. This parable has been spiritualized so thoroughly that its original texture has almost entirely disappeared from how most modern readers encounter it. But in the physical world of first-century Palestine, this story was told in the language of things everyone in the audience had touched and smelled and tended and feared. The oil lamp was not decorative. It was the difference between a household that functioned after dark and one that did not. Oil was expensive, pressed from olives that took years to mature, harvested in a narrow autumn window, stored carefully against spoilage. A lamp that went out at the wrong moment was not a minor inconvenience. It was a failure of preparation with real consequences. And the young women waiting for the bridegroom, the Parthenos, the virgins, the members of the wedding party, whose role was to escort the groom to the bride's home with lit torches or lamps, were performing a specific, recognized social function. Their readiness was not metaphorical. It was required. The 5 who were unprepared did not simply forget an abstract spiritual discipline. They failed at something concrete, something visible, something that anyone watching from the street could assess. And the door, once shut, was shut. Because in a world without streetlights, without reliable communication, without the ability to verify identity in the dark, a closed door at midnight was a boundary that protected everyone inside it. The night the groom came was not announced in advance. This is the detail that reorients everything, and it is a detail that the modern reader almost always misses, because we live in a world of calendars and confirmations, and the anxious courtesy of giving people notice. In the world of first-century Jewish Palestine, the timing of the groom's arrival to take his bride was deliberately, structurally uncertain. He came when his father gave him permission to go, and the father withheld that permission until he was satisfied that the room was ready, that the provisions were sufficient, that the household was prepared to receive a new member. The groom himself, in the most literal sense, did not know the exact day or hour of his own wedding night. That knowledge belonged to the father alone. When the room was finally declared ready, the groom would gather his companions, his closest friends, the men who would escort him through the village, and they would set out, often at night, with torches and music, and the kind of noise that was itself an announcement. The procession was not quiet. It was meant to be heard. Villages were small and ears were sharp, and the sound of a wedding procession moving through the dark lanes was a sound that brought people to their doorways, that woke sleeping children, that sent a particular ripple of anticipation through every household it passed. The bride's household had been waiting, but they had been waiting without certainty, which is a different kind of waiting entirely. A waiting that cannot be discharged by patience alone, that requires a constant, low-level readiness that does not resolve itself until the moment arrives. Her lamp had to be full. Her clothes had to be prepared. The women of her household, the friends who would accompany her, had to be ready to rise from sleep if necessary and take their place in the procession. There was no graceful way to be caught unprepared. There was no asking the groom to wait while you trimmed your wick and refilled your vessel. The procession arrived and you were ready, or you were not. When the sound of the groom's procession reached the bride's house, everything accelerated into a controlled, practiced chaos. The oil lamps were raised. The veiling of the bride, the tzif, the covering that concealed her face and marked her transition from daughter to wife, was performed by the women of her household with gestures that were old enough to reach back to Rebecca, who covered herself when she saw Isaac coming across the field toward her. The veil was not a romantic accessory. It was a boundary marker, a visible sign of the change in status that was happening in real time. The woman inside the veil was no longer simply her father's daughter. She was her husband's wife, and the veil announced that to every eye that fell on her. The procession through the village was public in a way that had legal and social weight. The community witnessed it. Neighbors who watched from doorways were, in a sense, witnesses to the marriage. Participants in the communal acknowledgement that this union was real, sanctioned, celebrated. The noise of it, the light of it, the movement of it through the dark village lanes was a kind of living document, written not in ink, but in torchlight and song. It could not be denied afterward. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard it. The marriage existed now not only in a contract held by two fathers, but in the memory of an entire community. When the procession arrived at the groom's father's house, at the room that had been built, sealed, prepared, the couple entered together, and the door was shut behind them. The wedding feast would continue outside, sometimes for days, with food and wine and music, sustained by the families and by the community's obligation of celebration. But the couple was inside, alone together, perhaps for the very first time without supervision or the mediating presence of family. The intimacy they were now entering had been preceded by everything described here: the negotiations, the contract, the year of separation, the waiting, the procession, the veil, the witnesses, and all of that structure was not an obstacle to love. It was, in the logic of that world, its foundation. This is the moment to sit with what all of this means when you carry it back into the text. When Mary of Nazareth receives the announcement of the angel, that she will conceive and bear a son who will be called the Son of the Most High, she is in the Arusin, in the binding betrothal period, already legally Joseph's wife, and yet still living in her father's house, the room in Joseph's family compound not yet ready to receive her. The scandal of her pregnancy was not merely social embarrassment. It was a legal crisis of the most serious kind. Under the terms of the betrothal contract, a pregnancy that could not be attributed to the husband was grounds for formal accusation, public exposure, and consequences that the law of Moses described in terms that left no room for ambiguity. Joseph's decision to divorce her quietly, to dissolve the contract without public accusation, was not the cautious action of a confused man trying to avoid awkwardness. It was an act of deliberate, costly mercy, performed by a man who had every legal right to do otherwise and chose not to. Matthew calls Joseph a righteous man. In the Greek, the word is dikaios, just, lawful, aligned with the covenant. And Matthew uses this word precisely at the moment when Joseph chooses to absorb a shame he did not deserve, rather than expose a woman to consequences she could not survive. The righteousness of Joseph was not his strict adherence to the letter of the law. It was his willingness to bear a cost in order to protect. That is what made him the right man to raise the Son of God in a house in Nazareth, in a room he had built with his own hands, in a world where stone and oil and waiting and procession were the language through which love made itself visible. And Jesus, who grew up in that house, who watched that village, who carried water from that well, and helped press oil from those olives and laid stones for those rooms, when he stood before crowds and spoke of a bridegroom who goes away to prepare a place and returns for his bride, he was not constructing a theological abstraction. He was telling them the story of their own lives. He was saying, "You already know what this feels like. You have already lived inside this structure of promise and waiting and arrival. You know what it means to keep your lamp full through a long, uncertain night. You know what it means for the door to open or to find it shut." The kingdom of God, in the teaching of Jesus, did not arrive as a foreign concept requiring translation. It arrived as the deepest logic of the world his audience already inhabited, made visible in its fullest possible meaning. The bridegroom was not a metaphor borrowed from elsewhere. He was the truth that the entire institution of marriage in Israel had always been, in some sense, pointing toward the covenant love that seeks, prepares, comes, and brings home. Miriam, whatever her real name was, whatever village she came from, whatever room was built for her in whatever hillside compound, lived her whole life inside a structure of meaning she may not have been able to articulate, but that she knew in her body, in her waiting, in the weight of the veil placed over her face by her mother's careful hands. She did not choose her husband the way the modern world chooses. She trusted the structure that held her, entered it with whatever courage she had, and found, if she was fortunate, and if he was the kind of man the law and the community hoped he would be, that the room had been built well, that the walls held, that the roof kept out the rain, that the lamp was full, and that he had come.